Then it really hit me. I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all.
Those 4 words, spoken into a headset 400,000 kilometers from home, are supposed to be the peak of a human life. The wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all. But for one astronaut, the memory of standing on the lunar surface carries a weight that has nothing to do with wonder at all. This is not a true story. There is no real astronaut named in what follows, no real space agency being accused of anything, and no real cover-up being reported. What you're about to hear is a piece of fiction, speculative, atmospheric, and built for the screen, imagining what might have happened if an Apollo-era mission had stumbled onto something the textbooks couldn't explain. Think of it as a what-if born from the golden age of lunar exploration, not a claim about history. With that said, let's tell the story. Call him Colonel Marcus Ellard. In this story, Ellard is a composite of the kind of man NASA actually did send to the moon during the Apollo years, a former test pilot, an engineer by training, a man who had flown supersonic jets before most people had ever seen one up close. Precision was his language. Facts were his religion. He was not the kind of man prone to imagination or exaggeration, which is exactly why, decades later, what he claims to have seen is so unsettling to the people who hear it. Ellard joined the astronaut corps in the mid-1960s, one of a handful of pilots chosen out of thousands of applicants. He flew a support role on an early lunar mission before finally getting his own flight. Call it Apollo 19, a mission that, in our story, extends the real Apollo program by 2 flights that never actually happened. He and his mission commander, Commander Alan Reyes, spent 3 days on the surface, in a highland region far rougher and more remote than any of the real landing sites. Their job was geology, collect samples, run experiments, drive the rover across ancient, cratered ground that no human eye had studied up close. It was supposed to be, in NASA's own dry language, nominal. Routine. The kind of mission where the biggest surprise is a rock that turns out to be older than expected. That is not how it went. According to the story, the first thing Ellard noticed wasn't dramatic. It was light. Sunlight on an airless world is supposed to be a flat, blinding white. No atmosphere to scatter it. No haze to soften it. That's basic physics, the kind every astronaut learns before they're ever allowed near a spacecraft. But Ellard later described moments when the light seemed to carry faint color at the edges of his vision. A hint of blue, a flicker of violet. Gone the instant he turned to look directly at it. He mentioned it to Reyes once off the record, and Reyes admitted he'd noticed something too, though neither man reported it. What would they even say? The sunlight looked wrong for a second. It sounds like fatigue. It sounds like a visor artifact. It sounds like nothing, until you felt it yourself. Then there was the sound. On the moon, in reality and in this story, sound cannot travel. No air, no medium, no way for vibrations to reach a human ear except through direct contact or radio. And yet, Ellard described, in later interviews imagined for this piece, something that resembled a low tone, almost musical, threading through the silence during moments of stillness. He asked Reyes if he heard it too. Reyes said yes. Neither man reported that either. And then there was time. Ellard would glance at his suit's mission clock, certain only a few minutes had passed since his last check, only to find 20 minutes gone. Other times the opposite happened. An hour's worth of work compressed into what felt like 5 subjective minutes. Reyes noticed the same drift. Their internal sense of time and the mission clock never quite agreed for the rest of the surface day. None of this made it into the official record. 2 of the most disciplined pilots in the astronaut corps chose silence because, as Ellard put it years later in this fictional account, who exactly do you report that to? And what do you think happens to your flight status afterward? The real story, the one this piece builds toward, happens on the mission's second surface excursion, 6 kilometers from the lunar module, on the far side of a ridge where even the Earth had dropped below the horizon. Ellard and Reyes were alone in every sense that mattered. Alone on a world with no atmosphere, no rescue within reach, and now briefly, no line of sight to their own spacecraft. They were collecting samples along the ridge, methodical, almost mechanical work, the kind of task that lets your mind wander while your hands do the job. Ellard has said that's exactly what was happening when he looked up and stopped moving entirely. Something about the horizon was wrong. On the moon, texture is chaos. Craters overlapping craters, rubble flung by impacts that predate human history, no straight lines, no repeating angles, nothing built by any hand. But what Ellard saw breaking the horizon line had edges. Regular ones. Angles that repeated. A geometry that had no business existing on a world shaped only by collision and erosion. He called Reyes over. Reyes stopped the rover without a word and stared at the same spot for a long moment before saying quietly, "I see it too." They drove closer. The dust kicked up by the rover's wheels hung strangely in the vacuum, drifting instead of settling the way dust does on Earth, and then falling slowly, like a held breath being released. Neither man spoke as the distance closed, and the shapes resolved into something unmistakable, a low wall, or perhaps the exposed edge of something buried far larger, made of angular blocks dulled by a thick layer of lunar dust. Not the product of an impact, not the product of any geological process either man had spent years training to recognize. Built, deliberately built, by something with intention. In this imagined version of events, Ellard keyed his radio and described exactly what he saw to mission control, in the flat, careful language every astronaut is trained to use under pressure. Geometric structure, not natural in origin, approximately partially buried. Requesting guidance. Then he waited for the response that always comes within about a second and a half of transmission delay. It didn't come. 5 seconds. 10. 20. In the story, Ellard describes counting seconds the way test pilots are trained to, a habit so automatic it becomes involuntary, and realizing somewhere around the 30-second mark that this silence was nothing like the ordinary radio delay. It was longer than any communication gap either man had experienced on the entire mission. When the response finally arrived, it was clipped, procedural, and utterly without curiosity. Continue with planned surface activities. No follow-up questions. No request for more detail. No acknowledgement, even that two men had just reported something that upended everything they'd been taught about the moon. Just an instruction to move on, as though the observation had been expected, or as though someone on the other end of that silence needed a moment to decide how to respond to something that wasn't supposed to happen. Ellard and Reyes, in this story, didn't fully move on. They took photographs, dozens, from multiple angles, close enough to show the texture of the blocks and wide enough to show the structure against the horizon, before continuing with their assigned tasks. Ellard has said, in this fictional retelling, that he remembers the weight of the camera in his glove and the certainty that whatever those photographs showed, they showed it clearly. Those photographs in the story were never released. Not because of some grand conspiracy, but because, as later fictional interviews suggest, the tangle of classification, archival loss, and institutional caution around unexplained material tends to bury things quietly rather than dramatically. Nobody has to conspire. Paperwork and discomfort do the work all by themselves. Years pass in this story, as they did for the real Apollo astronauts. The men who walked on the moon age, retire, and eventually gather, in our fictional account, for a private reunion decades after their missions ended. It's there, according to the story, that Ellard first hears other pilots quietly admit to anomalies of their own, strange light, impossible sound, a persistent and unshakable sense of being observed by something vast and patient. None of them had told the others before, not because of any explicit order to stay silent, but because of something more mundane and more human, the fear of being disbelieved, of having a lifetime of credibility undone by a single strange story. So each man carried it alone for decades, until age finally made the risk of speaking feel smaller than the weight of staying quiet. That's the emotional core of this piece, not aliens, not cover-ups in the cinematic sense, but the very human phenomenon of brave, rigorously trained people choosing silence, because the alternative felt like professional suicide. It's a dynamic that shows up again and again in real history, from military pilots to deep-sea researchers to scientists sitting on inconvenient data. Institutions are often less interested in truth than in avoiding disruption, and individuals learned to read that appetite quickly. The final section of Ellard's fictional account addresses the real mystery this story is built around. Why did the Apollo program end so abruptly, with so much capability still on the table? In our timeline, that answer is well documented: Vietnam-era budget pressure, shifting political priorities, and a public that had, within a few short years, gone from rapt attention to indifference. The real story doesn't need embellishment. It's a story about funding cycles and shifting national attention, which is a far more common way for ambitious programs to die than any secret. But in this fictional narrative, Ellard offers a different, more romantic explanation: not malice, not a grand cover-up, but what he calls institutional paralysis. An agency sitting on data that complicates the story it has already told the public, and finding it easier, year after year, to simply not revisit the question. It's less a conspiracy than a kind of bureaucratic inertia. Nobody decides to bury the truth, they just keep deciding not to be the one who digs it back up. Whether or not you find that explanation satisfying is really the point of telling a story like this one. It lets us ask, safely, and without accusing anyone real of anything, what it might feel like to encounter something genuinely inexplicable while representing an institution that has no framework for explaining it. Colonel Marcus Ellard, Commander Alan Reyes, and the Ridge in the Highlands are inventions, a way of exploring, through fiction, a question that has fascinated people since Apollo 17 splashed down and humanity didn't go back for half a century. What would it feel like to find something on another world that our training never prepared us for? The moon, in reality, holds no known structures, no verified anomalies, and no astronaut testimony matching this account. What it does hold is exactly what the real missions found: ancient regolith, scientifically extraordinary geology, and the quiet, undeniable fact that 12 real human beings once stood on its surface and looked back at Earth. That's a strange and wonderful enough story on its own, and it's the one worth remembering, even as we tell ourselves fictional ones to sit alongside it.